So hello everyone. I've had way too much coffee and way too little sleep, so don't expect much. This is gonna bomb hard. My name is Nikas. I'm a tech lead at Hostmaker, which is a remote-first home rental management startup based in London, but operating all over the world in different cities. I work there remotely from Vilnius. And about 6 months ago, we were at the final stages of our long migration to React and Node. But we had one glaring omission of all our suite of products, and that was our main website. It was first originally built by a third-party company, and it was starting to show its age. It was slow, and it was running on a legacy stack with very, very, very slow builds, upwards of like half an hour at some points. Those builds weren't very reliable, and they were crashing all the time, and we were deploying to like both S3 and Elastic Beanstalk and that kind of stuff. And we also, around that time, we got pretty lucky with the business because they decided that they wanted a brand refresh. You know, they hired a new designer, and that always needs a redesign because everything is wrong at that point. So we took the chance and we decided to do a rewrite because that's always a great idea. And we looked at our stack and we figured that we had a few challenges for this new rewrite. So first of all, we knew we were going to have tons of unique content. I mentioned that we are operating all over the world in different cities. That's around 9 cities now. Each of those cities have their own country hub, and they have to support multiple languages, so the local language plus English. And we knew we were going to have a pretty large website with around 15 unique templates or routes, or however you want to call it. In addition to that, we were going to have a lot of dynamically generated content, because we knew we didn't want to get back into the same position where for every single minor change, we needed to get developer time on it. And that all amounted to, we did some back-of-the-napkin calculations, and it was like 1,500 or more unique pages with their own unique URL and that sort of stuff. And that's pretty daunting for us. We also knew we wanted to have all of those cities be very indexable by search engine bots like Google and the other one. It all had to be very fast, obviously. So our original website was built like most client-side based websites are nowadays. It was basically whenever a user would come to the website would make a request to the API, and then the API would do the business logic, and it would return all of that data, and then the browser would render everything to the user and display. And then another user would come, and then the website would go to the API would do the business, and then return everything to the website, and then the browser would render everything. And then another user would come, and yada, yada, yada. You get it. We're doing a lot of unnecessary work, it would seem, especially for content that would never change sometimes. So what if we could do something like this instead? We don't really need to change most of that content, so why don't we just render it once, do all of that business logic, and then just keep serving those static HTML files back to the user? What would that give us? Well, first of all, it should be extremely fast, because you don't need to wait for content. You don't need to build anything or render anything. It's already there. It's an HTML file. You just send it over, and it's on the browser. And since it's just an HTML file, once it's up, it's up. It never changes. So there's no moving parts, and you don't have to spend nights debugging why that one request just failed while the others were completely fine. It also would mean that we would have an extremely easy deployment, because you've got your HTML files and you just put them up with, I don't know, FTP or something like that, if you're crazy. And that seems like a pretty great dev experience to me. So we knew we wanted to explore that idea a little bit more. And we had a few inspirations. So my personal website is built on GitHub Pages. It's using like a fairly old static site generator called Jekyll. And while it's old and kind of cumbersome to use, I was really blown away by how powerful it was the first time I used it. And I didn't know, like I came from a Java background, and like, you know, there always has to be a server or something like that. And I was just like surprised how much I could achieve with just, you know, some templates and JavaScript. And also around that time, Gatsby was getting quite popular. They had just announced their like VC funding, and they were trying to spin up a company and become a startup, like everyone these days. So we figured, hey, why not try a static site generator? Those are getting popular. So at that point, we looked at the market, and we had a few very clear options. So why the hell did we go with this one? Well, when we were looking at various static site generators, we knew we wanted to generate a lot of dynamic content. And for Gatsby, I hope this loads, but For Gatsby, the documentation, when we opened it up, it just proved quite frightening to us. Had just we're finishing up our migration, as I mentioned, and we didn't want like all of our people who were scared coming from Rails into JavaScript, into the JavaScript world, to get even more scared by things like GraphQL. So we kind of kept looking. And as we kept looking, one of our colleagues, the one who is subscribed to all the JavaScript newsletters in the world, he said, hey, there's a new cool thing. Maybe you should check it out. It's called React Static. And we looked at the documentation for that, and that was extremely refreshing to us, because it's basically, hey, there's this one function. As long as you implement it and return, we'll do the rest. So we tried experimenting with it more. React Static is a fast and lightweight framework for statically generating sites. But the thing that really hooked us was it was the promise of a power of Gatsby without all of the complexity attached to it. And that it's also just React. So people wouldn't have to learn new stuff, and they could just reuse their JavaScript knowledge. So how does it work? So React Static works pretty much the same as all the other static site generators. You basically have your source, and then you have a build step which turns all of those source templates into HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which you can then put on your CDN. For React Static, there's a main entry point. As you can see, it's all JavaScript. And that entry point, if you look there, is still just JavaScript. So you've got this one function. This is basically enough to get you started with React Static. You just return your path and the components that those paths will map to, and then React Static should take care of everything else. What this means is that you can also use, since the function is asynchronous, you can also fetch data if you want, and you can then iterate over that data and render each page individually. So it also gives you a lot of options. So what if you want to do something like pagination? Here's pagination in 10 lines using Lodash. And it's all custom code, so you don't have to use a helper function or read the documentation or anything like that. You're just using stuff that you already know from JavaScript, and you can do that. So basically, it was just JavaScript. And since it's just JavaScript, and JavaScript is powerful, it meant that we could do pretty much whatever we came up with, and we could achieve that in this static site generator. Now, at this point, you might be all excited, but what about dynamic content? So in a regular website, whenever there's a content change happening after one of the users visits the site, it's all fine, because the next user will just fetch the new data coming from the API at that point. But we can't really do that with a static site generator, because remember, it never changes. Once it's built, it's there. But thankfully, webhooks come to the rescue. So whatever your content management system, it's very easy to trigger a webhook request, which would then trigger a build in one of your continuous integration servers. So whenever your data changes, you just rebuild the entire website, or just parts of it, if you want to feel fancy. So we took everything about React Static and we went with it. We spent about 1 month implementing the first 3 or 4 pages for the initial launch, as well as our entire sign-up flow. And we were really happy with the results. There were a few things that went extremely well. So first of all, it was very customizable. We had never used a static framework in production before, but it allowed us to use all of the fancy new stuff that we wanted to, including CSS modules, ImageX for dynamic image optimization, translations and localized content, dynamic sign-up flows, and we even implemented user sessions at some point. So now, once the app bootstraps, it progressively enhances itself to be kind of just like a regular client-side application. We even have a bit of a custom Webpack config to achieve basically some of these. And we could all do all of that. But most importantly, it did everything it had to. So we got pretty great performance out of the box. We didn't have to mess around with manual code splitting or setting up that huge Webpack configuration, because it gave all of that to us immediately. It also was a pretty great development experience. There was hot reloading out of the box. The logs are great. And we started with around 500 pre-built pages for the initial launch. And now we're up to 1,500, and we're now loading data from more than 12 endpoints. And it's still just 4 minutes of build time. And we really feel that it's a solution that can scale long-term for us. And coming from half-an-hour builds, this is a pretty impressive number for us. There are a few things that didn't go well, but mainly it boils down to it's different. So even though you're not running on Node and you're not running on a server, there's still a build step that runs in Node. So you have to be aware that you can't always use the obvious solution. You can't always rely on window being there, and there's like things like universal components, and you have to lazy load them. And there's a lot of stuff that you need to kind of look into. So our main takeaway here was probably to always make sure to read the documentation, then don't try to reinvent the wheel too much. Just use whatever the framework you're using recommends. And that seemed to get us pretty far. As far as this whole experience, our main takeaway from it was don't be afraid to experiment. We picked a new technology, and we picked a very small part of it with this tiny framework. And we couldn't have been happier with the results. So sometimes you have to be bold and just kind of try and go for it. Well, while preparing for this talk, we kind of looked around, trying to find out if there's a name for this, and it turns out there is. It's called the Jamstack, which is a very fun name, but it stands for JavaScript, Reusable APIs, and Pre-built Markup. And it's basically a whole community of people experimenting with just this exact solution of building websites statically and then serving them up and adding, enhancing them with functionality from JavaScript to have them dynamic. And it's not just us doing it. So you might have heard of this small little website called Smashing Magazine. They went through a similar transformation to us about a year before us in March 2017. And they're running their static website on Hugo, which is a Go-based static site generator. And they've had huge, tremendous success. They report times of at least tenfold increases in performance. Now, you might be asking what all of this means to you, because this, there's a lot of people coming from Angular here, and I kind of feel like I have a target on my back here, speaking for React. But it's all coming to a framework near you. So whatever framework you're using, whatever tech stack you have, there is a solution, there's a static site generator out there for you. And a lot of them are really, really good. So even if you don't like React, you can pick a vanilla static site generator, and there's a few of those. There's Vue ones. You might notice that Angular is missing there. And that's because Angular kind of supports all of this out of the box. And I've noticed there were a few really good talks, one of them by Ulrich Schaked, about how you can achieve a static site generation in Angular, whatever it's called now. And that's cool. Basically, it means you can use whatever you want and achieve something similar to us. But the thing that really, by the way, when I was making this slide, I was looking for the color yellow, and turns out there's an npm package called JavaScript yellow, and it's just the color yellow. And I think that really illustrates like the number of packages that keep growing that we had in one of the first talks. But the best thing about all of this is that it's free. So there's been like a huge community now coming up of people experimenting with just how quickly can you deploy something on the internet. And there's services like Netify, there's the original one, GitHub Pages, there's Now by Zeit, and they all basically have a very generous free tier, which allows you to put stuff up basically with the click of a button or one run of a command on the internet for everyone to see, entirely free. And it's all very easy to use if you have a static website. So I very, very much encourage you to, the next time you're building something, maybe try static and see if it works for you. So thank you all. You can see a live demo of all of this at hostmaker.com/careers. And well, let's keep in touch.